A neighbor of mine, Carol, gave me a pine cone for my birthday a few years ago. Not a card, a pine cone. She'd tied a little loop of twine around the top of it, and she handed it to me at the gate like it was the most normal thing in the world. And she said, "Hang this near your tomatoes and watch what it does." What I didn't know then is that she'd just handed me a working humidity indicator and a home for the insects that would eventually clean the aphids off my beds. I said thank you the way you say thank you when someone hands you a rock. I genuinely thought she'd lost it a little. I put it on a hook by the back beds, mostly so I wouldn't have to explain why I'd thrown it out. That pine cone is still there. I check it most mornings now, and I owe Carol an apology because it turns out she handed me one of the most useful and one of the most misunderstood things you can put in a garden. Here's the thing. If you type pine cone and garden into a search bar, most of what comes back is nonsense. You'll be told a pine cone predicts the weather, or that hanging one repels pests, or that it brings luck to your vegetables. Almost none of that holds up. But underneath the folklore, there are two things a pine cone actually does, and they're real enough and well enough studied that I've changed how I run my whole garden around them. Let me start with the one Carol was pointing at. A pine cone is a hygrometer, a working one. That's not a metaphor, that's mechanics. A cone opens and closes depending on how much moisture is in the air, and it does it without any living tissue at all. The cone you hang up is technically dead, and it still moves. When the relative humidity drops and the air is dry, the scales spread wide open. When the humidity climbs, when rain is coming, when the dew sits heavy, those scales pull themselves shut. The reason is something called hygroscopic movement, and the mechanism has actually been mapped out in detail. A study published in 2022 in the journal Advanced Science, led by a researcher named Christopher Eager at the University of Freiburg and the LiveMats Cluster of Excellence, broke the scale down layer by layer. Each scale is built from two tissue layers, bound together by cellulose microfibrils oriented in different directions that absorb water at different rates. The bottom layer swells more than the top one when it takes on moisture, so when the air gets damp, that bottom layer expands and the whole scale curls inward and closes. When it dries out, it shrinks back and the scale opens up again. Two materials, two different swelling speeds, one moving structure, no cells, no signals, no energy, just physics. It's so reliable that the same study describes the pine cone as a model for engineers building artificial actuators, materials that respond to moisture on their own with no power source designed directly from how the cone scale works. That field has a name, biomimicry, designing human-made materials and structures by copying mechanisms found in nature. The pine cone is one of its most studied examples. The humble Scots pine cone on my hook, Pinus sylvestris if you want to look it up, is running the same mechanism a materials lab is trying to copy. So what do you do with that? You read it. On a dry afternoon when my cone is wide open, the relative humidity around my beds is low, the air is thirsty, and that's usually the day the soil is pulling moisture out faster than I think. When the cone has quietly closed up overnight, the humidity is high, the dew is sitting on everything, and watering would just be piling water onto an already damp morning. I stopped watering on a schedule and started watering on what the cone and the soil were telling me together. I lost fewer plants to overwatering that first summer than I had in years. Now I want you to stop for a second, because this next part is the one Carol never even mentioned, and it's the one that genuinely changed my mind about the whole thing. An open pine cone is structurally a tiny apartment block. All those gaps between the scales are dry, sheltered, protected little chambers, and a specific group of insects loves them. Lacewings and ladybugs, the two best friends a vegetable garden has, both look for exactly this kind of structure to overwinter in. The common green lacewing Chrysoperla carnea is the species most likely to move into your garden cone. A single lacewing larva will eat hundreds of aphids before it's even grown up. Ladybugs do something similar, and they tuck themselves into dry crevices when the cold comes, often clustering together in real numbers, and a pine cone makes close to a perfect shelter for them. This is the part that surprised me. People pay money for this. You can buy a thing called an insect hotel, a little wooden box stuffed with hollow stems and cones, sold specifically to give beneficial insects a place to shelter so they're alive and hungry in your garden the following spring. The single most recommended material to put inside one is the pine cone. Carol had basically handed me a one-room version of a product I'd later see on a garden center shelf for the price of a decent lunch. It does matter where you put it, and this is the bit most people get wrong. These insects want shelter, not exposure. The advice from the people who study this is consistent. Hang or tuck your cones somewhere that faces roughly south or southeast, up off the ground, sheltered from the worst of the wind and the heavy rain, a quiet corner that still catches some morning warmth. Get that right, and the cone stops being decoration and starts being habitat. So when those scales close up in the damp, they're not just reading the weather for you. They're closing the door on whatever has moved in, holding shelter, keeping a population of pest eaters alive through the months when your garden looks dead. And when spring comes and the air dries and the scales open again, they walk out into your beds right when the aphids are waking up. The timing isn't an accident. They evolved to track the same signals the cone is built to track. This is, if you want the proper term for it, integrated pest management, or IPM, working through your garden's own ecology rather than a spray bottle. The cone is doing two jobs at once: reading conditions and housing the solution. I started leaving cones in 3 corners after that first one, all of them in spots that catch the morning sun. The lacewing population in my garden now is the kind of thing I used to spend money on, releasing them from little tubs, and now it just shows up on its own. A couple of honest notes, because I'd rather tell you than have you find out the hard way. Use a cone that fell on its own and is fully open and dry. A fresh green cone straight off the tree is still sticky with resin and full of moisture, and it won't read humidity properly until it's dried out. And don't bother sealing it or treating it or painting it. Anything you coat it with stops the scales from moving and ruins the only 2 things it was ever good for: bare cone, a bit of twine, a sheltered sunny corner. That's the entire setup. That's really it. There's no luck in it. There's no weather prophecy. There's no pest it scares off just by sitting there. There's a dead cone that tells you the relative humidity better than your phone does, and an open cone that quietly houses the insects that protect everything you're trying to grow. 2 true things buried under a pile of folklore that almost made me throw the whole idea away. Carol's pine cone is still on the same hook by the tomatoes, still opening and closing every morning like it's reporting for work. It opened this morning. Dry day coming. It knew before I did.